same gimmicks, copycat characters.
It's often said that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. Well, if that's true,
That's
then
true.
the performers we're going to be looking at today must be huge fans of one another, as what they all represent is
Or
two or
just
more
not
people
too
who are
great.
effectively working the same gimmick. Yes, this kind of thing happens from time to time in wrestling, but just who are the best examples of this in wrestling history? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at
That's
right
actually
now,
great.
starting with L.A. Knight and
Yeah.
the way he mimics both Stone Cold
Oh,
Steve
yeah.
Austin and The Rock.
Yeah,
That's
he's
right,
like a
L.A. Knight is
combo.
what happens when you put all the mannerisms and cadences of Steve Austin and The Rock into a blender, mix them up, pour them out, and present them to a modern-day audience. And this makes him a hugely entertaining 90s-style throwback, so entertaining that he's managed to become something of a cult sensation with fans over the last year or so. But what is it exactly about the Maryland native which makes him so similar to the Attitude Era stars? Well, it's a few things. For one, it's the way he talks, something that is uncannily similar to The Rock and Austin, and within that cadence, there's also his catchphrase-heavy style, something he's definitely taken from the Great One. Then, of course, there are the other smaller details, such as the fact that he wears that leather vest down to the ring, a nod to the
Yeah.
rattlesnake, that or his penchant for wearing sunglasses, something the People's Champion was often known to do. And let's not forget about his in-ring style. After all, in a modern landscape where high-octane work rate is so often the order of the day, L.A. Knight feels like a guy who's come right out of the 90s with his more brawling nature. But then when everything else he does seems to be inspired by that era's top two stars, perhaps this should come as no surprise. Yes, when it comes to L.A. Knight, clearly he's someone who was watching Raw back in the day, and clearly he's someone who took what he saw on board big time. But he's not the only person who has a gimmick almost indistinguishable from Steve Austin, as the exact same thing could be said about the Sandman. In this case, though, it's less of someone borrowing from the rattlesnake and more of a case of him borrowing from them, because the Sandman actually came first. That's right, before Stone Cold was ever a thing on Monday nights. In fact, back when he was still working in WCW, James Fullington was developing the character of a hard-drinking, hard-brawling anti-hero who didn't take any BS from anyone. Hell, go back and watch early ECW on the WWE Network, and you'll see the Sandman right there in front of your eyes, drinking a few beers on his way down to the ring, and then proceeding to engage in wild
Interesting.
brawls, the kind we would later see from Austin during the Attitude Era. And this is what made him such a hero of the people then, despite the fact that by mid-90s standards, his character could have been seen as a heel in some circles. So what happened here? Was this a case of Stone Cold taking someone else's gimmick? After all, he was in ECW himself for a while. No,
Interesting.
it's probably just a case of them both having similar personalities, as the Stone Cold
Probably.
character was always described as being the real Austin, but with the volume turned up. And with
Yeah.
Austin having a far bigger stage to
actually the
get his
best.
character over on, it meant his own beer-drinking, hard-brawling antics at the turn of the millennium became far more popular than the Sandman's ever had. That said, for those real ones who want to see where the idea actually first presented itself, they'll always be able to go back and watch the old ECW shows where Fullington was creating the gimmick which would later change the industry, and doing it in a far grittier and more dangerous feeling way. It's kind of like the underground band that creates a new sound, only for that sound to later be broken into the mainstream by a more popular act. Think the Pixies and how they later inspired Nirvana. But what of
So
one of
this
the other
Copycat
top
was
stars of the
better.
Attitude Era, Triple H? Doesn't he deserve a spot on today's video too?
Let's
After
see.
all, his gimmick of the game is very similar to what Shane Douglas was doing over in ECW as the franchise at the same time. Yes, go watch that original worked shoot promo from 1999 where Triple H sits down with Jim Ross and airs his grievances about being held back, the one in which he first refers to himself as the game. Everything about it, whether on purpose or by accident, screams Shane Douglas. And it's not just the way he talks here, or the fact that the game and the franchise are effectively the same gimmick. No, it's also the way Paul Levesque dresses, right down to the painfully 90s backwards leather Kangol hat. That's right, in the years since
Yeah,
the
it
90s,
actually
many fans
is.
have pointed out the fact that these two characters are a lot more similar than they first appear. And while we aren't saying that Triple H copied Shane, there certainly may have been some inspiration he found in what Douglas was doing over in ECW at the time. How does Douglas himself feel about this? He doesn't seem to have a problem with it. No, when questioned on the topic in interviews, he said that he recognizes that everyone takes inspiration from someone else, even him. And considering the heat he allegedly had with the Clique back during his brief mid-90s WWF run, That's saying something. But let's move away from the Attitude Era for now and onto something more modern, specifically the modern day, as that's where we'll find our next two subjects with similar gimmicks, Valhalla and Max the Impaler. And unlike with Triple H and Shane Douglas, there does appear to be a bit of bad blood involved in this one, as while both Valhalla and Max the Impaler do share that Viking-inspired wasteland warrior character, it's been made clear that the latter one feels like she's been ripped off. Of course, if you agree with her in this assessment, it's not hard to see why, as these are two gimmicks which are almost identical in their nature, right down to the ring gear, face paint, and mannerisms in the ring. And Max the Impaler
Okay, like the mannerism in the ring and like the acts and the gimmicks in the ring, okay, we can say Copycat. But the way they are looking, it's Viking inspired. That's not really it's not original, you know, like it's not something they came up with.
Certainly did come first, as Max has been doing her thing since as early as 2018,
like
all while Sarah Logan didn't morph into Valhalla until 2022. That said, Logan has since defended herself against accusations of gimmick infringement here, with her saying that, while similar, she doesn't feel the two gimmicks are the same. Rather, she claims her inspiration came from the fact her husband Eric and his tag team partner Ivar were already working a Viking gimmick in WWE as the Viking Raiders, and so when it was suggested she join the group, her filling the same role made all the sense in the world. Hell, she'd even go on to say that the idea of her being a Viking priestess helping out the Raiders was actually suggested by none other than Xavier Woods. Regardless though, the fact remains the two characters are incredibly similar, and for that reason, they deserve a spot on today's video. If nothing else, their inclusion highlights Max, someone who really doesn't get enough love on account of her being mostly hidden away in Billy Corgan's NWA. So let it be known that she is great in her own right, and while you're watching Max the Impaler on the NWA, maybe take a moment to go back and watch some old Impact shows too, in order to see the dual gimmicks of Ethan Page and the Karate Man, as they're pretty much identical to what was being seen at around the same time in WWE with Elias and Ezekiel.
Really?
Yes, most fans will be aware of the saga that was Elias and Ezekiel, two purported twin brothers who were played by the same person in Jeffrey Ciulo. For those who weren't watching TNA at around this same time though, you might not have been aware that there was a very similar gimmick playing itself out there too, and this one was being done by current NXT star Ethan Page. That's right, before he was being booked by Shawn Michaels, before he was even a part of the AEW roster, All Ego was making a name for himself on the Impact roster, and in 2020, during the height of the lockdown, the way he was doing this was by introducing a new alter ego of his named the Karate Man. Who was the Karate Man? Well, he was exactly what you'd expect. A gimmick created by someone who clearly grew up loving Ralph Macchio in The Karate Kid. And this was pretty fun to watch, especially during the low point, which was 2020. Of course, given it was the lockdown era, cinematic matches were all the rage, and that made it all the much easier for the Karate Man to actually face off with Ethan Page at one point when the two went one-on-one at January 16th, 2021's Hard to Kill show, something Elias and Ezekiel never managed to do. Which one was the better example of a multiple personality gimmick? Well, that all depends on your own personal tastes. Each one was fun in its own way, and each one got over with their respective audiences at the time. But this wasn't the only time two comedic characters found themselves working very similar characters, as WWE has been known to remix certain gimmicks from time to time on their own shows. And this was certainly evident when No Way Jose made his debut in 2016 and immediately drew comparisons to another very similar character, Adam Rose. After all, they both share pretty much the exact same gimmick, with that gimmick being a party leader who leads his crew down to the ring, often in the form of a dance. And what makes this one all the more peculiar is that both No Way Jose and Adam Rose were around at about the same time. In fact, for a brief period, they even crossed over in 2016 when Rose was in the Social Outcasts and Jose was down in NXT. Of course, at this point though, with the South African star having dropped the dancing aspect of his character, it was able to be handed over to his developmental counterpart and carried on by them instead. That's right, from 2014 right up until 2020, there was technically an unbroken chain of party boys on WWE TV. Why did the company feel the need to redo this gimmick so quickly? That's hard to say. Maybe it was because it was a great way to get live crowds excited.
Exactly,
and maybe that's why it was dropped once and for all in 2020 when No Way Jose was released, as this was the period no fans were allowed in attendance at shows. Yes, this pair represent a very recent example of two performers using the exact same character and in such close proximity to one another too. And given how much WWE seemed to like the idea, we wouldn't be surprised to see them try try this one again at some point in the near future. But let's move away from dancers and partiers for a while and on to the world of honorary faction members instead, as it's in those we find our next two similar gimmicks, that of Sami Zayn and R-Truth. Yes, as it turns out, this pair have one key thing connecting them, and this is that at one point, they were both honorary members of a hugely popular faction. That's right, it was back in 2022 that Sami first truly broke out on the main roster when he became the honorary Uce of the Bloodline, with this serving the dual purpose of getting him over as a top guy in short order, and also kickstarting WWE's recent wave of creative success. Not that all the members of the Bloodline were so happy to accept the Canadian at first, though. No, Jey Uso in particular took a while to warm to him, but over time, even he came to love Zayn, and this led to one of the best storylines we've seen in decades. One which climaxed when the man famously trained by El Generico turned babyface on the stable at the 2023 Royal Rumble, and then went on to challenge Roman Reigns for the undisputed WWE Universal Championship in his hometown of Montreal. So with the huge success of this angle, it only made sense WWE would want to try and replicate it. And that's exactly what they did later in 2023, when R-Truth began trying to ingratiate himself into Raw's top group, the Judgment Day. No, this one never had quite the same magic spark that Sami and the Bloodline had, but with Truth being such a funny guy, it was still hugely entertaining to see him try and bumble his way into the faction's good graces for a few months. And unlike Sami, who failed to beat Roman for the world title, R-Truth would actually get the climactic win everyone wanted here, as at WrestleMania 40, after the Judgment Day had given him a beatdown and made his status within their ranks clear, he was able to team with The Miz to take the Raw Tag Team titles away from Finn Balor and Damian Priest. It's just a shame our next subjects never got their big moments in the sun in WWE then, as whether it was Lex Luger or Chris Masters, the narcissist gimmick just never quite clicked. Yes, despite Vince McMahon himself being an avid bodybuilder, he, for one reason or another, could never make this character work. Sure, he really gave it a go with Lex Luger back in 1993, as that was when he brought the Buffalo native in from WCW and had him parade.
But also, like, his gimmick didn't last long because he changed
around the ring, flexing his muscles in front of a bunch of mirrors, usually while someone like Bobby Heenan gushed on the mic about how sculpted his physique was. That said, this never really added up to a real main event heel run for the narcissist. No, things wouldn't really begin to show any signs of turning around for Luger until he abruptly turned babyface later that year, and suddenly started being presented as WWF's new Hulk Hogan. And even then, this ended up flopping when he failed to defeat Yokozuna for the world title at SummerSlam. But despite the whole thing not working out, the boss would keep the idea in his back pocket for further use at a later date, with this later date eventually coming in 2005. This was when the masterpiece Chris Masters became the newest member of the Raw roster, all while also becoming the newest person to carry the narcissist gimmick. Yes, like with Lex Luger before him, Masters' role here was mostly to flex his muscles and admire them all the while. And when he wasn't doing that, he was making short work of a series of jobber opponents with his Master Lock challenge. Unfortunately for him though, like with Luger back in 1993, this never really managed to get over with fans in any significant kind of way, suggesting it was a gimmick that people just didn't care to see, no matter what decade they were in. And things would only get worse for the masterpiece as time went on, because after WWE instituted their wellness policy, he got noticeably smaller. So obviously then you can't be a narcissistic bodybuilder if you don't have the huge body to go with it. But let's move over to the ladies for a while, as they're no stranger to borrowing a gimmick or two themselves, something which can be seen in Kairi Sane's current pirate gimmick, something which was similar to Paul Burchill's character. Now, Paul Burchill's time as a pirate in WWE was a relatively...
A pirate gimmick? Seriously? We all know where that comes from.
Brief one, so you'd be forgiven for not remembering it all too well, but it did happen. And it happened all the way back in 2006. Why had the WWE chosen to go with such a character at this point? Well, because it was around this time that Pirates of the Caribbean had become a cultural phenomenon, and Captain Jack Sparrow was a Halloween costume favorite of young men all over the world. As you can probably guess, however, Pirate Paul Burchill didn't have quite the same staying power as Jack Sparrow, and so it ultimately ended up being a gimmick that would be dropped after about a year or so. But it wouldn't be the last time such a gimmick was used in wrestling, as over in Hikari, Japan, a young Kairi Sane may well have been watching and developing a fascination of her own with the pirate's life. So when she started sailing in college then, it would spark an idea
Oh
for
my
her
God,
wrestling
it also
character,
reminds me of
one
One
that she would use
Piece.
in Stardom between 2011 and 2017, and which would be called the Pirate Princess. And when
Why
she
did
joined
she
WWE
stop?
after that, she'd bring this gimmick along with her. And this time around, Kyrie would get the gimmick so much more over with fans than Paul Burchill ever managed to do. After all, when you've got an elbow drop that could rival even the great Randy Savage, you earn fans' love and adoration pretty quickly. Sure, the more swashbuckling aspects of her character might have been played down somewhat in recent years, as now she's
Yeah.
found herself in more of a hit woman role alongside her Damage Control counterparts Io Sky, Asuka, and Dakota Kai. But we're pretty sure that there's room for her to bring the hat and shop's helm
I
down
would
to the
love
ring with her
that.
again in the future once she reverts
She's
back
so
to being a more
cute.
traditional babyface. And who knows, once that happens, maybe our next subjects will finally have made it to the main roster. A group of mafiosos who took more than a little inspiration from the FBI,
Tony! I
NXT's
saw
The
Tony.
Family. Yes, it's time to talk about the
Yeah!
full-blooded Italians, a group which
The
first made its
Family.
presence felt in mid to late 90s ECW and eventually became a staple of mid-2000s SmackDown. What was their gimmick? Well, it was that they were a group with strong ties to the mob. That's right, this was a time when The Sopranos was the biggest TV show in the world, so the idea was to roll with what was popular. And this one got over so hugely with the ECW faithful, which was exactly why WWE felt so good about bringing the gimmick back out of storage during the early 2020s. No, this new version wouldn't go by the name of the FBI anymore, and they wouldn't include names like Little Guido, Tony Mamaluke, and Big Vito. Rather, they would be called The Family, and their ranks would be made up of Tony
I love The
D'Angelo,
Family.
Channing Lorenzo, and Adriano Rizzo, among others. But the idea was very clearly similar. A group of wrestlers who, if you asked them what they did for a living, they'd probably say something like waste management. And while it might seem like a cheesy gimmick for a 2020s audience, The Family have made it work, arguably even more successfully than the FBI did back during the
Yeah.
90s and 2000s, because as it stands today, they're one of the top stables on NXT,
Oh,
with
yeah.
them being two-time NXT Tag Team Champions, one-time NXT Heritage Cup winners, and Tony being the current North American champ,
Yep.
too. And the two groups recently had a special moment together at NXT's episode live from the old ECW
Oh, yeah,
arena,
when he went
where
against the
Nunzio
yeah,
lost in a
yeah.
fun match against Tony
That was
himself.
so funny,
But what about our
man.
next subjects, that being Kevin Thorne
love that.
and his 90s vampire equivalent, Gangrel? What made these two characters so similar? Well, as we said a moment ago, they were both vampires. And that's not something we have a lot of
Oh.
inside the squared circle.
True,
No,
we don't
while there
have a lot
are
of
plenty
those.
of books, movies, and even TV shows
Sounds
about
really
this
fun,
subject, it's
though.
rarely a gimmick which has been used inside of a wrestling ring. And that's because it's so goofy, it's considered a little too far for most.
Can
But
you
that
believe
do-
like it's goofy in the wrestling world, but in all these books and series and movies, it can be really epic. I maybe they don't do it right.
doesn't mean it hasn't worked from time to time. Hell,
Yeah.
Gangrel managed to get his lover of red viscous liquid over during the peak years of the Attitude Era, and this was a time when there was so much competition on the roster, it was hard to stand out amongst so many other great characters. But then that's just a testament to how good David Heath was in the role and how much he threw himself into the gimmick. Sadly though, the same could not be said for the second attempt at vampirism in WWE, because when Kevin Thorne came around during 2006 with an all-new Creature of the Night character, it flopped pretty quickly. Of course, part of the reason for this can be blamed on the canvas he was given to paint on though, as being locked away on WWECW certainly didn't help the Memphis native to make a splash at any point during this run, especially when his allies were the likes of Elijah Burke, Matt Stryker, and Marcus Corvon. Still, even if he'd been on Raw or SmackDown, we're going to guess this one would have flopped just as hard. But then maybe it was always destined to,
I mean,
as
the way
fans
he-
already had a great
he's
vampire
putting the
character
makeup
in
on.
Gangrel. So there was really no need for another version during the mid-2000s. Hell, at that point,
Okay, like if you had a vampire like Blade, for example.
David Heath was still active on the
yeah.
indie circuit, so he could have been brought back had Vince McMahon really wanted him there, and this was largely what contributed toward the Kevin Thorne character being axed altogether in 2007. Who knows though? Maybe before all is said and done, he'll make a grand return to WWE under this guise once more and, in the process, get over with fans more this time. And if it does, it'll be yet another example of a gimmick being reused and reworked in a successful way, just like every other
Okay.
example we've looked at today.
Oh my god, this is such a cool video. But a lot of those I didn't even like know the names or know that the gimmicks existed like that. And some of them like are far-fetched, like a pirate gimmick, like come on, of course it's gonna be from the movies, or like Italian mafia or so. Like these gimmicks are so easy to be taking or inspired by anything out there. from the media and entertainment. It doesn't have to be that it's taken from another wrestler per se. I feel like one of the strongest would be LA Knight for me, even though you put it at the start. Maybe it's because something that is relevant even today, and I can see it today really clearly. But from the first moment I saw it, I saw immediately Steve Austin and The Rock. The way he speaks on the mic, The Rock, and behaves, but also the way he is dressing and the way he is wrestling, taken from Austin. But that is it, guys, for today's video. I hope you enjoyed. Thanks so much for watching. See you in the next one. Bye!